I'd like to welcome you all to Joseph Beth Booksellers today. Thank you for coming. We are pleased to have with us author John Barry to sign Rising Tide, a new book about the Great Mississippi Flood of 1927 and how it changed America. It was recently praised by James Carville, who said, "I've just finished the brand new book on the Great Flood, and I've been sending it to all my friends. It's Rising Tide. It is the best book I've read in years." Also, the New York Times has praised this book, saying, quote, "Rising Tide stands not only as a powerful story of disaster, but as an accomplished and important social history, magisterial in its scope and fiercely dedicated to unearthing truth." And, as well, the Boston Globe is high in praise for this book. Will Haygood says, "Legions of writers have taken on the Mississippi River. Poets, travel writers, essayists, foolish journalists. As much of its saga lies on dry land as in the river itself, and no one has told that part of the story with the verve, passionate energy, and literary bravado that John M. Barry now does in Rising Tide. It is nothing less than the story of America itself." John, why don't you come and share with us some of your thoughts on this book?
Thank you very much. Thank you. I appreciate that. I want to tell you the story of the greatest disaster, natural disaster in American history, although, as a matter of fact, some would say it was not a natural disaster, it was a man-made disaster, but more about that in a minute. What I'm talking about is the 1927 Mississippi River flood, but it's important for you to think of what the Mississippi River is. It is not something that begins in Minnesota and runs due south to the Gulf of Mexico. You could just as easily say it begins a few miles south of Buffalo, New York. You could say it begins in Alberta and Saskatchewan in Canada. You could say it begins near Taos, New Mexico, in Frostburg, Maryland. Of course, the Ohio River, the Missouri River, the Canadian River, the Arkansas River, and, literally hundreds of rivers all drain down the Mississippi River. 31 states, all a part of 31 states, drain down the Mississippi. And that is the enormity of what we're talking about. It's a drainage basin that's 20% more than the Nile. It's 15 times that of the Rhine. It's the third largest drainage basin in the world. Behind the Amazon River is significantly larger. The Congo is just marginally larger. And then comes the Mississippi. Of course, there have always been floods. And I want to read a report of a flood from really one of the first white men ever to see the Mississippi River. This is Garcilaso de la Vega, who was a member of De Soto's expedition. He recorded the river's power. "Then God, our Lord, hindered the work with a mighty flood of the great river, which came down with an enormous increase of water, which, in the beginning, overflowed the wide level ground between the river and the cliffs. Then little by little it rose to the top of the cliffs. Soon it began to flow over the fields in an immense flood, and as the land was level, without any hills, there was nothing to stop the inundation. On the 18th of March, 1543, the river entered with ferocity through the gates of the town of Ammonoia." This was an Indian village near the present site of Greenville, Mississippi. "It was a beautiful thing to look upon the sea that had been fields. For on each side of the river, the water extended over 20 leagues, nearly 60 miles of land, and within all this area nothing was seen but the tops of the tallest trees. These floods occur every 14 years, according to what an old Indian woman told us, which can be verified if the country is conquered, as I hope it will be." We don't know how big the flood in 1543 really was, but the flood of 1927 was by far the greatest flood that has ever been recorded in this land on any river in recorded history. It really began in August 1926 when it started raining. By normally late summer, early fall, rivers are almost at their lowest. They're almost dry in much of the country, particularly out west. But at this time, the rain was intense enough that by early September, you had record floods in Kansas on the Neosho River and on the Illinois River in Illinois, and these are 600 miles apart. In fact, the Illinois River went into flood on September 5th, 1926, and did not come out of flood, did not fall below flood stage until July 1927. In October, again, when rivers are normally low, the upper Mississippi actually went into flood. And at Vicksburg, only 6 times in history had the flood gauge ever broken 30 feet. And each spring, the river had set a record flood. It had been a record or near record flood. Never had the flood gauge at Vicksburg broken 31 feet. In October 1926, the gauge broke 40 feet. In the last 3 months of 1926, every single river gauge on the 3 greatest rivers of North America, the Ohio River, the Missouri River, and the Mississippi River, every single river gauge had a highest average reading ever recorded for that time of year. So everyone who had half of a brain could anticipate that there was going to be trouble in the spring of 1927 if there was anything like an ordinary rain, much less anything more intense. On New Year's Day, the Mississippi River at Cairo, Illinois, which is really where the lower Mississippi begins, where the confluence of the Ohio and the upper Mississippi and the Missouri had come in just below that. On New Year's Day, it went into flood at Cairo, Illinois. It would not fall below flood stage until late June. Chattanooga and Nashville, which are on 2 different rivers, although they're both in Tennessee, were flooded. Soon thereafter, Pittsburgh was flooded, Cincinnati was flooded, Louisville was flooded. In the West, 32 towns in Kansas were flooded. Oklahoma City was flooded, and there were deaths from Oklahoma to West Virginia and above the lower Mississippi. The flood was already, the Mississippi River was already at a record stage. It was already the greatest flood in history on April 15th, 1927. In fact, prior to that, 4 storms in the preceding 4 months, each of which was greater, had struck the area, each one of which was greater than any single storm in the preceding 10 years. On April 15th, 1927, which happened to be Good Friday, one of the great storms in history struck. It 8 inches of rain west past Little Rock, Arkansas. They put 7 inches of rain almost to the Tennessee-North Carolina border in the east. It put 10 inches of rain into southern Illinois and Missouri. And in New Orleans, it gave 14.96 inches of rain in 18 hours. So New Orleans, as you probably know, is one of the wetter cities in the United States. But 15 inches of rain actually is more than 25% of the total annual average precipitation that city receives. And it got it in 18 hours. And as I said, even before this storm, the Mississippi River was already on a record flood. Now, in the, I'm going to read a couple of pages from the book here, which comes from the prologue, and it's just as this storm, is set in Greenville, Mississippi, which is called the Queen City of the Delta. And it's, there was a party that day planned for Good Friday. The chief engineer of the local levee board was hosting it. In the middle of the party, it was raining so hard, the Greenville was right on the river. These men decided to leave the party and go look at the levee and see if they examined it, what, maybe there was something they could do that needed doing. So they leave the party and drive to the levee, get out. It was like facing an angry, dark ocean. The wind was fierce enough that day that it tore away roofs, smashed windows, and blew down the smokestack, 130 feet high and 54 inches in diameter, at the giant A.G. Weinman and Sons lumber mill. Destroyed half the 110-foot-high smokestack of the Chicago Mill and Lumber Company, and drove great chocolate waves against the levee, where the surf broke, splashing waist-high against the men, knocking them off balance before rolling down to the street. Out on the river, detritus swept past, whole trees, a roof, fence posts, upturned boats, the body of a mule. One man working on the levee recalled decades later, "I saw a whole tree just disappear, sucked under by the current, then saw it shoot up. They must have been 100 yards away. It looked like a missile fired by a submarine." The river seemed the most powerful thing in the world. Down from the Rocky Mountains of Colorado, this water had come. Down from Alberta and Saskatchewan in Canada. Down from the Allegheny Mountains in New York and Pennsylvania. Down from the Great Smokies in Tennessee. Down from the forests of Montana and the Iron Ranges of Minnesota and the plains of Illinois. From the breadth of the continent, down had come all the water that fell upon the earth and was not evaporated into the air or absorbed by the soil. Down as if poured through a funnel, down into this immense writhing snake of a river, this Mississippi. Even before this storm, levees along every significant tributary to the Mississippi had been shouldered aside by the water. In the east, Pittsburgh had seen 8 feet of water in city streets. In the west, outside Oklahoma City, 14 Mexican workers had drowned. And the Mississippi was still swelling, stretching, threatening to burst open entirely the system designed to contain it. At the peak of the great Mississippi River flood of 1993, you all recall that, the river in Iowa carried 435,000 cubic feet of water a second. They measure floods in cubic feet a second. At St. Louis, after the Missouri River added its waters, it carried 1 million cubic feet a second. It was enough water to devastate the Midwest and make headlines across the world. In 1927, a week after, and a few miles north of where Percy and the others stood upon the levee, the Mississippi River would be carrying in excess of 3 million cubic feet of water each second. Leroy Percy, who is one of the main characters in the book, Leroy Percy did not know the immensity of the flood bearing down upon him, but he knew that it was great. His family had fought the river for nearly a century, as they had fought everything that blocked their transforming the domain of the river into an empire that had allowed its rulers to go in a single generation from hunting panther in the cane jungle at the edge of their plantations to traveling to Europe for opera festivals. The Percys had fought Reconstruction, fought yellow fever, fought to build levees, all to create that empire. Only 5 years earlier, to preserve it, Leroy had fought the Ku Klux Klan as well. He had triumphed over all these enemies. Now the river threatened those triumphs, threatened the society his family had created. Percy was determined that, even if the river burst the levees, that society would survive. He had power, and he would do whatever was required to preserve it. 400 miles downriver from Greenville, the Mississippi flowed past New Orleans. There, a handful of men were Percy's peers, hunting and investing and playing poker with him and belonging to the same fine gentlemen's clubs. Some were men of the Old South, controlling hundreds of thousands of acres of timber or sugar cane or cotton. Some were men of the New South, financiers and entrepreneurs. Some, like Percy, bridged those worlds. For decades, they had controlled New Orleans and the entire state of Louisiana. The river threatened their society too, and, like Percy, they would do whatever was required to preserve it. Their struggle, like Percy's, began as one of man against nature. It became one of man against man. For the flood brought with it also a human storm. Honor and money collided. White and black collided. Regional and national power structures collided. The collisions shook America. On the levee in downtown Greenville, the men watched the river rage for a few more minutes. The rain stung. The river was literally awful. Yet they took a certain pride in its awfulness and the greatness of the river. Confronting it made them larger. For a few more minutes, frozen by it, they stood there. When they left, neither Senator Percy nor anyone else, not even Seguin Allen, the host, returned to the party. They would not go home for hours. Some would not go home for days. They had work to do. Now, what happened after this was the serious beginnings of the flood. In total, the flood made almost 1 million people homeless. That was very close to 1% of the population of the United States, which was only 120 million at the time. 700,000 people had to be fed by the Red Cross, many of them for up to 5 months. And the impact of this, and what interested me in doing the book, was exactly the impact. I mean, it was partly my love for the river, but partly that when you have an event of that enormity, I wanted to see what it did to the society. And it did a lot to the society. The most obvious thing was that it settled forever an argument that had gone on literally, really, for 500 years among engineers about how you handle flood control policy. That argument was quite definitively settled in 1927 by the Mississippi River. Incidentally, the same argument also ended up resolving certain issues regarding navigation of the river, shipping. Tremendous amount of money was at stake. The flood also, without a doubt, elected the next president of the United States. It also helped Huey Long become governor of Louisiana. One thing I didn't mention here was the business leaders in New Orleans made a decision to protect the city by blowing up the levee outside the city. To do this, they needed in fact, James Carville, we talked about earlier, sort of makes a point about that floods are different from other natural disasters. You can sit and hope that a tornado doesn't strike you, and you can sit and hope that a hurricane does not strike you, but you can't do anything about the tornado or a hurricane other than get into the basement. But a flood you can do something about. First, you can try to control the river and create all sorts of flood control projects. That's one thing. But another is you can blow up somebody else's flood control project. And in 1927, literally 2,000 miles of levees, there's essentially 1,000 miles on each side of the river on both banks, were patrolled 24 hours by armed guards. And the reason was they were there to prevent sabotage. And there were more than a dozen people killed in sabotage attempts in 1927. And in fact, in 1993, I know that there were rumors of sabotage of at least one levee. About 15 miles outside New Orleans, 2 people were killed and a third wounded when they approached the levee. They were shot, and the New York Times reaction to this was sort of a shrug. It said residents had been warned not to approach the levee after dark. What do you expect? But, you know, back to the point, so New Orleans, to protect the city, decided they were going to dynamite the levee. In fact, at the same site practically where these 2 men were killed. But the business leaders of New Orleans didn't do it through sabotage. It was a ruthless exercise of power. They had power, and they used it. And probably the worst part of it was, and it wasn't a racist thing, because the additional 10,000 people they made into refugees were whites, not blacks. But the worst part about that was that they promised compensation to the victims of the dynamite, and when it came time to pay, they paid only pennies on the dollar. And this this incensed the entire state of Louisiana against New Orleans and helped bring Huey Long in. You may recall Huey Long ran against what he called the plutocrats, the self-appointed rulers of the state, which precisely described the people who had decided to blow the levee up. Another thing the flood did was it ended a way of life in the South. You know, it changed Southern society forever, both in the Mississippi Delta, which was Senator Percy, the character I was talking about earlier, and New Orleans. It shifted the population of the United States. There was a great surge of black migration out of the Mississippi Delta after the flood. And for better or worse, it also presaged the New Deal. There were a lot of some psychological and cultural shifts, some actual legislation that sort of a little bit prepared the way for the New Deal. And finally, it helped shift black voters from the Republican Party to the Democratic Party. You recall, obviously, Lincoln freed the slaves. Therefore, blacks, in addition, southern states were obviously racist. Blacks could not vote. It was worse than segregation in that period. There was constant lynchings. And therefore, blacks supported the Republican Party. After the flood, they began to shift to the Democratic Party because of the reactions of the Republicans in national office. And I can talk on any of these points, obviously, now, but I think I would prefer to take questions. So do we have some questions? Is that a... No, that's a... Any? Yes?
You mentioned how the flood determines the next presidential election. Can you talk about that a little bit more?
Sure. Herbert Hoover was Secretary of Commerce at the time. Calvin Coolidge was President of the United States. Now, Coolidge appointed Hoover to take care, and Coolidge did nothing. In fact, when I say nothing, I mean he did nothing. There's a great Randy Newman song called Louisiana 1927. A version of it is also sung by Aaron Neville. And in the song it says, President Coolidge come down in a railroad train. Well, President Coolidge didn't come down in a railroad train. President Coolidge never visited any of the flooded territory, unlike your politicians today. In fact, Coolidge went much further. When Will Rogers asked Coolidge to send him a telegram that Rogers could read at a fundraising rally for the Red Cross, Coolidge refused. When somebody else asked Coolidge to autograph a picture of himself that they could auction off at another fundraising rally, Coolidge refused. Coolidge did absolutely nothing, but he did appoint Herbert Hoover. Now, Hoover had a lot of experience in relief. He had helped feed occupied Belgium during World War I, and after World War I, he had fed literally millions of people in Europe, which had been devastated by the war, of course. In fact, John Maynard Keynes says that Hoover was the only person who left the Versailles Peace Conference with his reputation enhanced. So it was natural for Coolidge to appoint him. There were 700,000 people being fed by the Red Cross. And you remember the 1993 flood, how every day it was on the front pages. Nationally, you know, on both coasts, in Washington, you know, in Los Angeles and Seattle, not just in the Mississippi Valley, but day after day after day. You turn on the network news, there's another flood picture. Well, 1927 was exactly the same way, only more so. It was a greater disaster, there was more coverage. And Hoover, not Hoolidge, Hoover, knew how to use the press. In fact, earlier he had helped create the modern sense of public relations as a science almost. And he had once said that the world lives by phrases. And his presidential ambitions were below zero when the flood started. He used the press and translated that into a march on the White House. In fact, James Carville, as I said, had reviewed the book, and I didn't know him before this, but he called me recently and told me that Hoover had a better press operation than any politician he knows today. He was actually envying it. So from below zero, in fact, there was, just before the flood, there were several purely political magazines that listed presidential candidates for 1928, And they even listed what they call dark horses. And even among the dark horses, 7 or 8 names, Hoover's name didn't even appear. And yet by the time the nomination came, as he said to a friend in the middle of the flood, looking at all the news coverage, he had a special train that carried him into the flooded area in boats. He made sure the press went with him. They had their own car. Anyway, Hoover turned to one of his friends and said, "I shall be the nominee. It is nearly inevitable." Yes?
Why do you think Coolidge didn't capitalize on this as a political force?
Well, Coolidge was not going to run for re-election, for one thing. For another, Coolidge was a little bit of a very strange man. For a third, personally, I think he was from Vermont. You know, this was 1927. That's barely 60 years after the end of the Civil War. The bulk of the disaster was in Louisiana, Mississippi, and Arkansas. I think there was some anti-Southern bias, frankly. You know, I mean, certainly he hadn't served in the Civil War, but people of his parents' generation had. And I think there was some real hostility there. In fact, you know, one question people often ask me is how come they haven't heard of this flood? And I don't know exactly. I mean, it was a tremendous disaster, obviously. I think I have 3 speculations. One is that it was just too big. It was so immense. It's not like the Chicago fire or the San Francisco earthquake where you can like get your hands around it and conceive of it in your imagination. I think it was so big it was kind of like a dog trying to bite a basketball. You can't quite get a handle on it. That's one speculation. The other speculation is that year the American Society of Newspaper Editors voted it almost unanimously as the greatest story of 1927. There was no question. Second was Charles Lindbergh crossing the Atlantic. And he actually took off in the middle of the flood and did drive it off the front pages during the flight. But I think America was becoming a celebrity culture, and everybody remembers Charles Lindbergh. You may not remember what year, but you know Lindbergh flew. So that's part of it, and there were no personalities to identify with the flood. 27 was also the year Babe Ruth hit 60 home runs. But the third, and I think maybe the most important reason, was again that sort of the institutional memory of the country is, at least in terms of history and intellectually social history, cultural history, I mean that's written by historians, and those people tend to be in New York and New England. And I think to that part of the country, they barely believe that the Mississippi Valley exists. And in the 1920s, I think the idea that, I mean, it just sort of faded, again, because of the anti-Southern bias. There was such a disdain among intellectuals who wrote things for the Deep South because of the race thing, that they never recorded it. They didn't care about it. And it just sort of faded when the generation who experienced died off. Other question? Yeah.
I'd be interested to hear more about the demographic shifts that took place.
Well, that actually is one of the more interesting aspects of the book. I mean, the person I read to you about, Senator Percy, was an amazing character. His name was Leroy Percy, and in fact, the same family, Walker Percy, the novelist, and, well, Shelby Foote was not a member of the family. Shelby Foote, the historian, whom you probably all know, wrote the Civil War and Ken Burns made famous and so forth. Shelby Foote was almost part of that family. He was very close to the family. Greenville, Mississippi was a very unusual place. Leroy Percy had been a U.S. Senator, was a trustee of the Rockefeller and Carnegie Foundations. He was a hunting partner of Teddy Roosevelt. In fact, he hosted the bear hunt in the Mississippi Delta that teddy bears came from. He was a governor of a Federal Reserve Bank. You know, he was one of the most powerful men in the country, really. And because of him, Greenville, Mississippi, which was, as I said, the Queen City of the Delta, had, and this was a really surprise to me as I started researching the book. You know, I had always assumed that maybe the worst place in America to be a black person would have been the Mississippi Delta. In fact, in the 1920s and before, it was certainly the best place in the South and one of the best places in America to be black. At a time when Southern politicians elsewhere were seriously debating whether or not that blacks should be taught to read, in Greenville, Mississippi, public schools taught blacks Latin. At a time when the Ku Klux Klan was electing the mayor of Portland, Oregon, and Portland, Maine, and controlling Indiana, controlling Colorado. In Greenville, Mississippi, the Percy family defeated the Ku Klux Klan and basically booted them out of the county. In fact, in Washington County, Mississippi, the heart of the Delta, there had only been 2 lynchings in the county's entire history. One was, as you might expect, a black man accused of quote, assault, unquote, on a white woman. But the other man lynched was a white man who had murdered a black. So this was sort of, and there were more important things in terms of economics. There was opportunity in the Mississippi Delta for blacks at the time. There was a larger percentage of black ownership of farms. In fact, they owned almost 2/3 of the farms in the Mississippi Delta in 1910. And this was at a time where elsewhere in the South, and particularly in Mississippi, where blacks were being driven off the land. But in the Delta, they still owned a majority of the farms. So what you had was an area where you had people like the Percys, a planter aristocracy, and you had blacks, but you had practically no poor whites whatsoever. And that was one reason they got along so well, because the Klan was identified with poor whites. And it was a different... So comes the flood. I mean, Percy, as I said earlier, had defeated the Klan and become a national hero because of it. He, was featured in the Atlantic Monthly. He wrote for the Atlantic Monthly. The editor of the Atlantic was his guest. He wrote for other progressive magazines at the time. But he had done so to protect his empire. He had done so to protect his black labor force. Not just his personal black labor force, but he sort of believed the entire Delta belonged to him in a sense. I mean, he was concerned with the entire Mississippi Delta, not just his own plantation. He was not the largest planter in the Delta. He was just the most important one. But when the flood came, everything reversed itself. He was concerned that the blacks, that you got to understand, there was water on one side, the Mississippi River was on one side, and the flood was on the other. I didn't really talk about the power of the flood. Just above Greenville, in the scene that I read at the opening, was in Greenville standing on the levee, the single largest levee break in the history of the Mississippi River occurred. And this one levee break was 3/4 of a mile wide, and 6 weeks after the break, an engineer sounded it with a 100-foot line and found no bottom. So it was 3/4 of a mile wide and more than 100 feet deep. And initially it was pouring out at 30 miles an hour. So you had more water pouring out. I mean, this one levee break flooded 50 miles east and 100 miles south and put water over the tops of houses in Yazoo City 75 miles away. And in Greenville there was a levee camp, a refugee camp, set up that stretched for more than 10 miles. There were a total of about 20,000 blacks in Greenville itself, either on the levee or in the courthouse or a couple of warehouses. There were also a lot of livestock, thousands of head of livestock. And the issue was there were no roads. They were under 10 to 30 feet of water. The railroads, same, under 10 to 30 feet of water. The flood on one side, the Mississippi River on the other. The levee was probably about, from that wall to maybe that black thing over there. We're talking about 30 to 40 feet wide, the crown of the levee. What do you do with these people? The water supply is contaminated. They don't even have water to drink. So the initial decision, interestingly, by Leroy Percy's son, William Alexander Percy, who was also a writer, who wrote a book called Lanterns on the Levee, which is still in print. The initial decision by Will Percy, the son, was to evacuate the refugees to high ground miles away. But Leroy Percy feared that if they were evacuated, that they would never return. So instead, the refugee camp became essentially a prison camp. And in fact, all the camps in Mississippi and many of them in Arkansas and Louisiana were effectively prison camps. Big laundry tags, like you see on a big laundry bag, were attached to the collars of the blacks. And on it was a plantation they came from, their work assignment, the inoculations they got. If they didn't work in Greenville, they weren't fed, but they weren't paid for their work. I mean, you know, they could not leave the camp except to go back to the plantation they came from, and only upon the signed request of the owner of the plantation. So, an emotional bond, the deal, essentially, the unofficial deal between the Percys and other aristocrats and the black labor force was snapped. It was broken. They had been protected from the Klan, in return for which they worked. So after the flood, partly because this deal was broken, but maybe more importantly, you know, there was nothing left. The river had just swept away literally thousands of buildings, thousands. So they had nothing to go back to. As a result, you know, the great migration of African Americans north, you could say, began in the 1870s. There was a spurt during and immediately after World War I, then it died back down. And then there was a huge spurt right after the flood, when tens and probably hundreds of thousands of blacks left Mississippi, Arkansas, and Louisiana. And then in the 1930s, the same migration dropped way down, dropped by more than 2/3 from the 20s in the 1930s. So it's definitely flood-related. That's the migration. And another question? Sorry I took so long answering it. Yeah.
I imagine it took years of cleanup afterwards. I was just wondering with the Depression, right on the heels of that, what kind of effect on the cleanup in the area, if any?
Well, oddly enough, it's said that, I mean, the Depression came, as you said, the stock market crash was 2 years later. But I'd said earlier that one of the things that the flood did was sort of lay a little bit of the groundwork for major government action in the New Deal. And one of these things, a lot of that is sort of a psychological shift in the country that maybe I'll talk about in a minute. But a lot of it was that Congress in 1928 passed the single largest piece of legislation it had ever considered, much less passed. It was, for the times, an enormous bill. And it set up an entirely new flood control system. And it assumed, the federal government assumed new responsibilities for the levees that it had never had. And as a result of which, there were actually a lot of jobs in Greenville during the Depression because of the construction of these flood control projects. So the Delta, and Greenville in particular, and a couple other smaller cities in the Delta, but Greenville was right on the river. The others, Clarksdale, Cleveland, and so forth, which are very well known for blues songs, you know, were more inland from the river. But in Greenville, there was actually probably less problems with the Depression because of federal dollars for flood control. But the maybe more significant than the as large as that bill was, maybe the more significant impact on the way the country thought and government action became psychological. Before the flood, Congress had once passed some money to help some farmers during a drought. And the president at the time had vetoed this appropriation, saying, quote, "There is no warrant in the Constitution for this benevolent impulse of the Congress." The idea was that you stood on your own 2 feet. You should be too proud to accept help from anybody. And in 1922, as a matter of fact, there had been another flood in Louisiana that made 35,000 people homeless in Louisiana alone. By any standard other than 1927, this was a tremendous disaster. But the governor at the time, who incidentally was a close friend of Leroy Percy and grew up on a neighboring plantation in Mississippi, the governor at the time said, "Louisiana has not asked for aid and will not." He was too proud to ask for any help with 35,000 of his citizens homeless. Louisiana was going to take care of it. Came 1927, he was no longer governor, but he was actually involved he was put in charge of the rescue work in Louisiana, and things had changed. With those numbers, the same guy suddenly wants all the help he can possibly get. Now, across the country, there was a similar reaction. I said Coolidge did nothing. There's 700,000 people being fed by the Red Cross. There was not a single dollar from the federal government that went to any of those people for anything, unless you count the salaries of Army engineers and Army officers, but there was no direct aid whatsoever, any kind. And in 1927, the federal government was not in deficit. It had a surplus, in fact, a record surplus in the Treasury. But they still didn't want to spend any money. And psychologically, the countries which had believed in social Darwinism and so forth, and, you know, again, you stand on your own 2 feet, charity is awful. Well, that's okay in some small cases, and maybe in larger cases too. But the country in large, overwhelmingly judged by editorial policy, well over 80% of the editorials in the United States condemned the failure of the federal government to do anything. And they called for a much more activist role in the federal government. And I know it was well over 80% because earlier I'd said Hoover had a press operation that James Carville said was better than any he knows of a politician today. Well, Hoover's press operation clipped newspapers from towns so small they don't exist on the map today, weeklies from places that I couldn't find existing on maps in 1927. You know, not only the New York Times, but the tiniest places. They collected literally hundreds of editorials around the country. He was running for president. He wanted to know what people thought. And they evaluated them, and they were the ones that said well over 80% of the editorials wanted a stronger federal role. Another question?
Yes, sir. I guess you answered some of this before I got here, but a couple of questions. One, are there any existing newsreel footages of the flood? And then following up again with Coolidge, because I heard you say on the radio yesterday that Coolidge didn't do anything even at the request of Will Rogers. Do you think that perhaps Coolidge, as well as other presidents, kind of thought that it was kind of beneath them to go down and get involved in a local or regional affair like that?
Well, regarding the first question, the newsreel footage, yeah, there is newsreel footage. Obviously, in the book, I couldn't use any. But I said earlier, Hoover and his press operation, well, he made sure that there was tremendous newsreel coverage. He made great accommodation for photographers, both still photographers and newsreel people, to follow him around everywhere. And there is certainly footage. It would be in the Hoover Library for sure, which is in West Branch, Iowa, about 30 miles from the Mississippi River. In fact, I was out there during the 1993 flood, which was quite an experience, believe me. Regarding the second question about Coolidge not doing anything, to some extent I answered it earlier here, but you raised a different question, a very provocative one, I think, when you asked, did a president think it was beneath him to go to this regional and local? And I had not thought of it in those terms myself. It's possible. I attributed it to anti-Southern bias because it was only 60 years after the end of the Civil War, and he was from Vermont and had been governor of Massachusetts before becoming first vice president, then president. But if it's the idea, I mean, I think other presidents had, Teddy Roosevelt went to New Orleans in the middle of the 1905 yellow fever epidemic. Now, you know, yellow fever, that's not like going to watch a flood. He was risking his life. He was risking his life by going in the yellow fever epidemic. And, I mean, part of the story I haven't talked about really at all almost is New Orleans. New Orleans was in the 20s a very interesting place. It was run, the social structure, the political structure, and the financial structure were all the same place. They were all in the gentlemen's clubs, and, which is no longer true and was not really true in any other city in the country. People with money and social position always had some power in the cities, but in other cities outside New Orleans, whether it be Boston or Chicago or New York, immigrant groups and machine politicians at least shared that power, But in New Orleans, that wasn't so. In New Orleans, the people with the power, and that's how they dynamited the levee. But back to Teddy Roosevelt, you know, they were so entranced by Teddy Roosevelt's visit in the middle of the yellow fever epidemic that they wanted to bring him into the Louisiana Club for a luncheon. The Louisiana Club has been called the most exclusive club in the United States. Its president was Edward Douglas White, who was Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court. And no guest has ever been allowed inside the Louisiana Club, ever. So they wanted to give a luncheon for the President of the United States. They decided they would make him, had to make him an honorary member to allow him to walk into the doors. Another question? Yes, sir.
You had mentioned that the flood in part being man-made. Have you talked about that one?
It's very important. There was this great argument in the 19th century between two engineers. And the first 60 or 70 pages of the book deals in detail with these people. In fact, I think they're among the, they're fascinating characters. One is James Buchanan Eads. Eads was from St. Louis. He invented the diving bell. He was entirely self-taught. He literally sold apples on the street when he was 12 years old and left school. Taught himself engineering, mathematics, and so forth. He invented the diving bell, walked on the bottom of the Mississippi River, and while he's walking on the bottom, he was developing theories about how the river worked. Became a millionaire, built ironclads during the Civil War, which won the first Union battles of the war for Grant when they besieged Forts Henry and Donelson on the Cumberland and Tennessee River. And then he built the first steel bridge in the world, which was at St. Louis. At the time, it had the widest arches of any bridge in the world. It was also the first bridge he had ever built. And, in fact, the bridge builder for the Pennsylvania Railroad was a consulting engineer on his bridge. And this Pennsylvania Railroad bridge builder looked at his designs and said, I refuse to imperil my reputation by attaching it to this design, which was doomed to fall into the river. And Eads' reaction to this report was to fire the consulting engineer and eliminate the position. That's how much self-confidence. And the bridge still stands. And they just, a couple of years ago, stopped sending railroads across it, 100 years after it was, more than 100 years after it was finished. So obviously Eads was right. Anyway, Eads had theories about how to control the entire river. And he had genius. But somebody else had power. This was a guy named Andrew Atkinson Humphreys, who was a general in the Civil War. But before the war, in 1850, started a report on the Mississippi River for the Army Corps of Engineers. Took him 11 years to finish the report. Came out right after the first Bull Run during the Civil War. He had it published privately in case he got killed in the war so it wouldn't get lost in the bureaucracy. And he was a warrior, a killer, frankly. He was a general, one of the bloodiest generals in the war. And after a charge he led at Fredericksburg, he said, I felt like a young girl of 16 at her first ball. I felt more like a god than a man. Then as an afterthought, he says to his friend in a letter, in 10 or 15 minutes I lost more than 1,000 officers and men, which was more than 20% of his command, and that's all he said about the losses. He was a warrior. When he and Eads collided over how to control the river, he said, we must get ready for a combat. It must be sharp and merciless. As I said, Eads had genius, Humphreys had power. Eads actually won the battle and forced Humphreys to resign from the Army and the Corps of Engineers. But the Army bureaucracy, the Corps of Engineers bureaucracy, was loyal to Humphreys. So over a period of years, they actually put into place Humphreys' policy, throwing out Eads' policy and throwing out every other civilian engineer's policy. And what they had was called the levees-only policy, which meant that you have no reservoirs anywhere on the river, no outlets anywhere on the river. And incidentally, just a few weeks ago, they opened the outlet above New Orleans for the first time in many years for this year's flood. They would have no cutoffs or no floodways or nothing of many other ways to use the river. You would have only levees. And the reason was, the theory was, you wanted to add water to the river instead of taking it out. They thought the more water in the river, the better. And the reason was, the more water, the faster the current would move. The faster the current would move, it would scour out the bottom of the river and naturally deepen the river. So in a sense, you got a natural dredging process. And in theory, this would deepen the river enough to accommodate a flood. And it was a very nice theory. Is one of my personal heroes in the book was an engineer named James Kemper, and he said, it is much easier to believe than to think. It is astounding how much more believing there is than thinking. And the Corps of Engineers believed this Levy's only theory, what Kemper called this impossible theory, and insisted that it was going to work despite criticism from Kemper and from large numbers of civilian engineers. They were the Army. They were going to do it their way, period. No discussion. In fact, there was a strong effort to get a hydraulics levee built to study the river and at least test these different theories on how the river works. And the Corps of Engineers actually opposed the building of the hydraulics laboratory. In fact, the General Lansing Beach, who was the head of the Corps of Engineers, said, the proposed hydraulics, let me emphasize, he said, the proposed hydraulics laboratory will have no results whatever that will be helpful to flood control. He said this in 1925, 2 years before the 1927 flood. So after the 27 flood, the Corps of Engineers no longer had any credibility, of course. Yeah, thankfully. Since then, they have built that laboratory. It covers acres of ground at Vicksburg and re-injected science into the Corps of Engineers, which is what you need, science. It's no longer strictly a military organization. It's not like it was before that. And plus, civilian hydraulic engineers have a lot more influence. There are just tests all over the place about what to do. And, of course, the entire policy toward river control has been turned on its head. Now you have spillways, such as I mentioned. They just opened this year in New Orleans a few weeks ago. You have reservoirs on the entire Ohio River Basin, on the very large reservoirs on the Missouri River Basin, smaller reservoirs on the upper Mississippi, which is actually the smallest of, contributes less water to the lower Mississippi than either the Missouri or the Ohio. And in places in the middle of the country where you can't really put reservoirs or you can't have a spillway, the spillway in New Orleans actually goes straight into salt water. It's called Lake Pontchartrain, but Lake Pontchartrain's really, it's salt water and it's more like a bay. It connects directly to the Gulf of Mexico. But in other areas, they have what they call floodways, which are essentially a controlled flood. They might make it 5 to 15 miles wide, and it's like a parallel river. And they let water into that when the river itself is flooding, so it's sort of a controlled flood. So now they can accommodate more water. Another question. Yes, sir.
You had said, another thing I heard there, that it essentially rained from August of 2016. How many inches of rain total fell during that time?
It's a good question, and one that I can't really give you. I can give you the question, can't give you the answer. The basin, the Mississippi Valley, before you sat down, I was laying it out. It goes from just below Buffalo, New York, to the Idaho border, includes parts of Canada, New Mexico, almost all of Colorado, and so forth. And at the time, I don't know that the Weather Bureau compiled figures that, answer your question. I don't think they did, because I've seen, and quote from at length in the book, their report on the 1927 flood, which does include anecdotal material, or not so much anecdotal, but not complete, but some precipitation data, but there's no totals in there over the entire Mississippi Valley. So I don't think they had it. They probably would have put it in that report. Anybody else? Is there anything I should say that I haven't said? guess that's probably about it then. And I thank you very much for your patience and listening, and I've certainly enjoyed it. Thank you.